That's a damn good apple right there. That's golden apples. I mean, they're not really gold. They're more red than gold, but I don't care. These things are delicious, okay? Because I'll tell you what right now. I don't care that Death Note, just released its one shot for the first time in what was like 10 years since the last one came out. I don't care if it's for the sake of a video. I don't care what the reason is. I am never walking into a grocery store and walking out with red delicious apples. Those are disgusting. Worst kind of apples ever. I hate the taste. I hate the texture of the skin. It's horrible, okay? You get me some golden or some yellow delicious apples and the Granny Smith, the green apples, a little bit of tartness. Delicious. But red delicious? Nope. Not happening. I would ask you to leave your apple preference in the comments below. Okay, so, hey everybody, how you doing? Tekking101 here, here to review the new chapter of Death Note. Okay, that is a weird thing to say out loud, alright? Alright, come and sit on Tekking's lap, everyone. Come on, I gotta tell you a story, alright? Death Note's one of the originals. It's one of the greats, okay? One of the big animes that got me interested in the whole medium. I mean, obviously, I was watching anime before Death Note, but Death Note really gave me something different, a different perspective, so to speak. My first anime I remember watching was probably like Dragon Ball or Yu Yu Hakusho back in the 90s. Eventually, I worked my way up to like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh!, the 4Kids One Piece dub. Naruto came out here in the States in 2005. And then Death Note came out in 2007 in the States on Adult Swim. And this was before Toonami was even part of Adult Swim, just Adult Swim, right? So, yeah, up until that point, a lot of just really mainstream anime, mostly shonen, that kind of, it permeated my life. And it was kind of silly if we're being straight up. I mean, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and, Dragon Ball. There's a lot of wacky moments in those series, Really awesome moments, too. But then you get to Death Note, and it's like, oh, okay, so first off, I'm excited because it's a different kind of style. We're not going to some fantasy world of magic and jutsu or, ki attacks and everything, or, the magical world of Pokemon or anything. It's just our world where we live, right? And it poses a very simple question, really. What would the world be like if somebody had the ability to kill other people, at a whim, essentially? I mean, just by name and a face, how would that change the world? And it is a really basic concept, which I think is the reason why it's been adapted so many times. There's been a lot of movies, and there's even been, dramas, television dramas and, plays done in the style of Death Note. The Netflix adaptation that came out back in 2017, because, the overall concept, pretty simple to understand, right? So, I remember watching it on Adult Swim back in 2007. It was so cool back then because, keep in mind, I was a freshman in high school when this first came out, okay? And not exactly with me, but I knew a lot of other kids around my age that were going through, the, edgy sort of, goth, not really goth, but just, the really edgy kind of teenage year kind of phase. Where you dye your hair black, you do all your shopping at Hot Topic, you wear the Gurr hoodies around. Remember the Gurr hoodies? I remember the Gurr hoodies. That was, everyone's dressing like an all-time low music video from, the mid to late 2000s. Man, that was a golden era, let me tell you. That was a golden Apple era. Barry, you weren't around yet, but let me tell you what there, Sonny. Okay, and the great thing about Death Note is I had friends in high school that really weren't that into anime, but they still watched Death Note. I remember freshman year, 4th period, was a study hall class, and I had a friend named Quentin and a friend named Nick, and we would just talk about the new episodes of Death Note that came out, and we would talk about the series and everything. I would eventually, bring my manga. That's actually, around the same time I started bringing my manga to school to read it during, study halls and stuff. So I have a lot of fond memories of this series, and I'm really glad they brought it back in a one-shot. Now, this is not the first one-shot that they've done, Oba and Obata Sensei. Back, I think it was 2 years after the initial manga ended, so probably 2009 or 2010 was when that first one-shot came out, and I'll talk about that briefly, but yeah, it's been the better part of a decade since we've gotten a new Death Note anything, in the actual context of the manga. As I've said, we've gotten some movies and dramas and plays and stuff since then. But, you know, it's the kind of thing that works in a lot of different media, so they obviously created something that stood the test of time so far, and I expect to see some other variations of Death Note media in the future. It's always a very popular thing, and hey, listen, I'll tell you something, I'm not a big fan of the Netflix adaptation, but I watched it all the way through, and I was like, I even think I did like a movie night with that, like I watched it with my fans, you know, back when I did that, and yeah, I mean, there were parts of it that were okay, it's just the overall thing and what they did with Light's character, I'm like, yeah, not a really big fan here, but anyway, let's talk about the one-shots, okay? So, the first one-shot, just a brief overview, that came out 2 years after the series ended, and it was, I think, 3 years after the actual storyline concluded. Like, Light dies 3 years later, that's when the first one-shot took place. Keep in mind the time frame of Death Note, which is something that's very important, you know, to actually follow the journey of Light and Ryuk and how many Death Notes are in the human world and, like, Misa and Mikami and all that stuff. Timelines are very, very integral to this story. In the manga, I think the story begins in late 2003. And that's going to be very, very important when we're talking about this one-shot released in 2020. Because that's one thing that I love, is that they actually went and referenced how a lot of stuff that Light did during the original story back in 2003 in the context of the manga, there's no way it would be as easy or even feasible to do nowadays with all the increase of security, you know, like cameras and dash cams everywhere, increased internet security and stuff like that. You know, so I love that they reference that, bringing Death Note. I'm like, okay, this is what happens if someone in 2003 in Japan gets their hands on a Death Note. Now what happens in the year 2020 if someone got their hands on a Death Note, okay? So that's interesting. It concludes, I believe, in 2010. Wait, no, 2000. Yeah, I think the manga does end in 2010, and I think the anime starts in 2006 and ends in like 2013 or something like that. So different timelines to keep in track of, because we're talking about the manga here, keeping track of the manga one, okay? So, yeah. So, that one shot, though, the first one, I wasn't a huge fan of it. Not really. It really did seem just like, hey, we're gonna do a Death Note story again. Alright, here's one, bye. Because that one didn't really have a lot of weight to it. The story behind that first one-shot was that another Shinigami named Menorah gets her hands on another Death Note from the Shinigami King. That one-shot was also, I think the most notable thing out of that entire first one-shot is we finally got to see what the Shinigami King looked like, and he looks every bit as horrifying as you could possibly imagine. He's like just this glob of eyes and just like suspended from the ceiling with a bunch of these feelers, just like but apparently he really likes apples, because if you give the Shinigami King 13 apples, he'll be like, oh, these are good, yeah, here, have another Death Note, because I guess the Shinigami King, I mean, he makes the rules, he decides what, how many Death Notes exist. I guess he just craps out more Death Notes whenever he wants. So that was the most interesting thing from that one shot, but no, Menorah is interested in Ryuk's adventure, going to the, you know, the human world and all the crazy stuff he got into, and so Menorah tries to do the same thing Ryuk did. However, she does not understand exactly, you know, humans are different, and you can't just give the Death Note to any random human and expect the same result that Light, you know, what he did with it. So Menorah goes to the world of living, gives a Death Note to just a random human, and they start using the Death Note, but they use it in a very different way than Light did. Basically the way that human, and we don't even get to see the human that used that Death Note. Nier takes to calling them C Kira or cheap Kira. You know, like diet discount, you know, caffeine-free Kira. So that Kira just uses the Death Note to, you know, write down people's names that already wish to die. So someone that's, like, terminally ill, or people that are very elderly, people that no longer wish to go on, that person decides to, like, take mercy on them, and that's how they choose to use the Death Note. However, eventually, Nier gets on television and is just like, I have no interest in this case. This Kira is not the real Kira. They do not interest me. I have more important stuff to do. And then, so it's like, oh, okay. And then Menorah comes back to the Shinigami realm with their Death Note and just like, yeah, Ryuk, I tried giving my notebook to a human, and it was, I guess, okay for a little while, but then eventually they just kind of stopped eating, and then eventually wrote their own name in the Death Note, and then let out a squeak, and then that was it. So, yeah. And Ryuk, the way he comes up with it, the way he conveys this to Menorah was, well, Light once told me that in order to use the Death Note effectively, you have to have a certain personality and a very strong conviction to your goals and ambitions, which Light definitely had in spades. You can't just give the notebook to any random human and expect to have the same ordeal that occurred with Light and L and all that stuff that spanned, you know, several years of this ongoing battle between L and Kira and L's successors eventually, right? Honestly, Ryuk just got really lucky with Light being the one that picked it up the first time, okay? So, that's how that one-shot went, and like I said, we don't even get to see the Kira, and the Kira wasn't even that interesting, okay? So, with this one, we have way more upgrades to that. Like, maybe they were like, kind of done with Death Note. Because I think at that point, wasn't Oba and Obata, weren't they working on Bakuman at that point? That was like their next series after Death Note. I've never read or watched Bakuman, but I hear it's really good, so I should probably check that out at some point. But maybe they were, when the process of them doing the first one-shot, they were just kind of done with Death Note, so they just kind of wrote something like, here's the continuation of the Death Note story. Here you go, but it wasn't that great. This one was definitely better, okay. So it actually picks up right after the ends of the first one-shot. Menorah comes back, it's 2013, and it's like, gives Ryuk the Death Note used by C. Kira. Okay, so Ryuk once again has 2 of them. I kind of went back to started to think about where all the Death Notes were in the human world. It was hard to keep track of all of them because Nier had the one at the end of the story. Remember that at the end of the manga, Nier had his hands on the actual Death Note, that at the warehouse. That was the whole thing. Like, Light thought for certain Mikami had the real notebook and he did the switch and he's like, I did it! I did it! I did it! I won, Nier! No, you didn't. What? No, you didn't because I one-upped your one-upsmanship. No! So, you know, that was like kind of confusing in that final like switcheroo, but no, pretty sure at the end of the Death Note manga, Nier had Light's notebook, so I'm assuming Nier probably destroyed it. In fact, I think it was even mentioned at the end of the manga, Nier destroyed them. There was no reason for him to keep them, and I mean, Nier's a pretty smart guy. He would have been like, if I keep this around, like, even if I keep it under lock and key in the Pentagon or some military base in the US, some protected area where no normal civilian could get their hands on it, that's not a good thing to keep that thing lying around. Because you'd figure, like, the FBI directors knew the notebook existed, the president and vice presidents of the United States of America knew the notebook existed, Nier told them it existed. So, you know, if you keep that thing around, it's only a matter of time until, like, a higher up in the US government or is like, hey, don't we have that notebook that can kill anybody as long as we write their names in it? We kind of need that right now. So I think Nier, the smart thing would just be to destroy it, and I think he did at the end of the story. So Ryuk has 2. He's got his Death Note, which he wrote Light's name in, and then he has the one given to him by Menorah, that spare one, okay? So Ryuk, you know, this time around, he's not really that interested in, because the first time it was like, this world is so rotten and boring, I want to liven it up a little bit. No, this time Ryuk is just hungry for apples. He's just like, man, it's been a good long while since I had me some apples. Tell you what, I'm gonna hop back into the human world, and hey, I got another Death Note. I got an extra one. I mean, I guess I could go back in the human world and, hey, maybe I could find someone like Light again that could feed me apples for a couple of years. Oh. Menorah gives Ryuk an apple and is like, yeah, it's good. All right, we'll give it another shot. Why not, okay? Viva, continue on, the power. You know what I love? The love about this whole thing is that, Nier might have stopped Kira, but Ryuk is still alive, and Ryuk is a Shinigami that can come and go between the dimensions as he pleases. So, you imagine, like, every 5-10 years, there's gonna be a new Death Note in the human world, and it's just more bullshit that Nier has to deal with. Like, you know, like, freaking, you know, the SB... Well, I guess they're not the SBK anymore, because the SBK was the special provision for Kira. Kira is no longer a thing. So, I guess they're just, like, regular, like, FBI agents now, But no, it's like every 5 or 10 years, like a member, like, I think Anthony Carter was one of the SBK members, Giovanni was another one. Like, they come in and like, Nier, we got another Kira, there's another Death Note. And Nier's like, ah, damn it. Alright, fine, let's call this one F Kira, because F this, I am so done with these damn notebooks. Where's he at? What's he doing? You know, and it lasts a little while, and then they die, and like, all right, good. And then like 7 years later, Nier, there's another Kira. I'm like, son of a, all right, M Kira. Let's just keep going down the line. So Ryuk or another Shinigami, they're gonna keep coming back and just messing with the humans. That's what I find funny about all this. So anyway, okay. Ryuk goes back to the human world this time, right? He's got an extra Death Note. He starts looking around specifically for very intelligent, like, middle school and high school students, because that's what Light was. And he's like, all right, let's try to do the same basic thing. So he looks around for a little while, and he discovers there's this kid named Minoru Tanaka. And he is a middle school student when Ryuk first finds him. And he has these really high intelligence score tests. Like, Ryuk is looking at the test, and, like, the teachers are talking about how smart this kid is. And Ryuk, he takes a very proactive approach this time. He doesn't just drop the Death Note for somebody to pick up. He just literally, like, Minoru's just hanging out at a playground doing, you know, shonen protagonist things. You know, just looking to the sky and wondering what could be. And then Ryuk just appears and just drops the Death Note on his head, and he's like, huh? What the? Was like, oh my god, what are you? He's like, yeah, congratulations, kid. You're the new owner of a Death Note, courtesy of me, Ryuk. Now, can I have some apples? You know, so we find out that Minoru, though, he's an interesting character. I like Minoru. He is intelligent, but he doesn't really apply himself so well. And, in fact, they even have, like a test he just took, and he got, like, a 28 on it. He was, like, really scoring low, like he failed this exam. And Ryuk's like, but I thought you were, like, you're supposed to be really intelligent. And Minoru's like, oh yeah, those are those weird IQ tests the school gives us. Yeah, I guess all that means is I'm really good at, like, problem solving and stuff. I'm not, like, really all that intelligent in terms of, like, book smarts, and I actually don't do that well on my tests. Or, like, my, like, subconscious intelligence is higher. Like, I'm good at quizzes and stuff. And so Ryuk is thinking about this, and he's like, huh, you know what? I think you might actually be good for this, Minoru. And he's like, okay. So they go back to his place. He gives him the Death Note. He gives him, here are the rules for it. Minoru's like, I can't read English. Why can't you translate this? I'm like, I was like, okay, fine. Ryuk, like, all right, fine. I'll write it in Japanese for you. You better get some apples out of this. Here, now you can read the rules. So Minoru's looking through the rules of the Death Note, and he's like, oh, you know, it's like 40 seconds, you know, time of death, controlled people, 6 minutes, 40 seconds, all that crap. And, they, you know, like, Kira Light existed in this world for many years, you know, and so Minoru at this point is, like, a middle school student, and he's like, oh, yeah, we learned all about Kira in our ethics classes, and then we had, like, world history classes, and, you know, oh, yeah, Ryuk is just like, oh, yeah, so they must have taught about him like he's one of the greats of history, right? And Minoru's like, no, they actually taught us about, in our ethics classes, how he was, like, the most evil person to ever live, and the world history classes just, you know, they put him in there as, like, a, you know, worldwide terrorist. So it's like, oh, okay, I mean, yeah, I mean, that makes sense that they would go that route with it, right? You know, I don't know what Light was expecting, you know, but that's what his legacy is now, all right? I guess at least he made his mark on history, if nothing else. I mean, right, he won't be forgotten, that's one thing, right? Or at least Kira will not be forgotten. And keep in mind, like, even at the end of the manga, after, like, the way they kind of convey this, yeah, this lady right here. At the very end of the Death Note manga, they have this kind of, like, mass in the middle of the mountains where these followers of Kira are all wearing, like, white hoods, kind of indicating that, like, yeah, Light might be dead and his journey and his story might be over, but there will always be followers of Kira. Always. You know, from now, like literally Light probably indirectly created his own religion. All right, because there will be people in the future that will consider him as a god and consider him what they did as, like, divine power, divine retribution, or whatever the hell you want to consider it. And yeah, this is, like, the beginnings of, like, a religion that Light indirectly created by him using the Death Note for so many years and doing the way that he did with it. So yeah, that continues on to this day. There are still followers of Kira in Minoru's time. So I should also keep in mind that I'm doing this chronologically. Ryuk first meets Minoru in 2007. When he's a middle school student. And then he's like, are you going to use the Death Note? If you don't, I can just, you know, you can give it back to me and your memories will be removed and I can give it to somebody else. And Minoru, he's like, all right. He thinks about it for a little bit and he goes back to Ryuk and he's like, okay, I have a couple of questions. I just want to hammer this out. And this is actually really cool because one of the great things about Light's character is he took every aspect of the Death Note and he was able to make it and spin it to his advantage. Like, the example is whenever someone touches the Death Note, they're able to see Ryuk, and that's just something you'll be like, oh, I gotta make sure nobody else touches this, so they'll be able to see a demon hanging out behind me. But Light uses that for his advantage. Early on in the story, when that guy does that bus jacking, he makes it so that guy touches a piece of the Death Note, and he can see Ryuk, and he freaks out, and he jumps off the bus, right? And the idea that the rule that whenever someone returns the Death Note, their memory memories go away. Light used that to his advantage in a supreme way during the Yotsuba arc. So Light looked at every little detail of the Death Note, and he really defined it down to the gnat's ass, and he's like, I'm going to use every aspect of this to my advantage, and he did. So Menorah is kind of doing the same thing here, and he's like looking through all the rules and like everything Ryuk told him, and he's like, hey, so it says that whoever uses the Death Note has to be possessed by a Shinigami. How far exactly can you leave my side? And Ryuk is like, oh, well, that's kind of a difficult question because that's never really been set like that way, like a specific distance. Like the Shinigami King doesn't decree like, Shinigami must stay within like a 1 kilometer radius of their Who-Man at all times, right? So he's like, no, there's really not a set distance. And so Minoru's like, okay, then just give me a number then. And, Ryuk is like, well, probably like 14 kilometers. I think that's something like 8 or 9 miles, something like that. Because that way, Ryuk can fly and he can phase through solid matter. So he's like, yeah, about 14 kilometers. Because that way I'd be able to still keep an eye on you and I'd be able to reach you at a moment's notice. So yeah, let's just say 14 kilometers. And Minoru's like, okay, good. He also asks Ryuk if there's anybody else in the world that can see him, and so he's like, yeah, there are, because there's still humans that never necessarily owned the Death Note, but touched it so they would still see me, like, Matsuda, Mogi, Aizawa, all of the previous members of the task force and all that stuff, that are still alive, Ida, all those guys, they would still be able to see Ryuk. So Minoru's like, okay, all right, right on, cool. Tell you what I'm gonna do. He returns ownership of the Death Note to Ryuk, and he tells him, come back here in 2 years. And I think I'll have everything set in 2 years. And so Ryuk's like, okay, but your memories are gonna go away. Yeah, it's fine. Just, here you go. So Ryuk's like, all right, if I come back in 2 years, then you'll give me all these apples? And he's like, yes, I will. And he's like, all right. So Ryuk's a little hesitant, but he's like, well, Light did weird stuff like this too. Ryuk kind of got bossed around by Light a lot, but at the end of the day, he always got apples. And so Ryuk's like, all right, I'm a little unorthodox, but I'll listen to you. So Minoru gives him back the Death Note, and then he returns 2 years later. Okay, and he drops the notebook back on Minoru, and Minoru, he becomes the new owner again, and he remembers everything from the previous 2 years, and he's like, okay, good, we can do this now. And Ryuk's like, why did you make me wait 2 years? And no, we got this set. And so Ryuk's like, all right, so who are you going to write in the Death Note? What's going to happen? How are you going to use it? And Minoru's like, oh, I'm not going to write anybody in here. I'm going to sell it. And you know what? When I read that, I was like, sell the Death Note. Well, it's certainly something new, right? It's a new angle where we're taking this, right? So I'm kind of happy with this. I'm happy with the way they went with it. I could see them sitting down, Oba and Obata, and they're sitting down and they're like, what new angle could we possibly take this that we haven't taken it before? I mean, we've already had the Death Note get in the hands of pretty much like the smartest guy in the world. Like, if Light was not the smartest person in the world, he was in the top 5. He was pretty up there. So we already had someone with that, like with a god complex and a crazy high IQ, get their hands on the notebook. With the last one shot, we explored what would happen if like a weak-willed, like regular guy got their hands on the Death Note. We've already explained like a fanatic, like Mikami, when they use the Death Note. Misa, someone in love, use the Death Note. I'm like, oh, there's all these different ways we've already done this. What other way could we possibly spin it so it's new and interesting? And they came up with this concept, okay? So, the way that Minoru does this, because he mentions, like, I can't do this the same way Light did it. Even Ryuk says, like, yeah, you probably couldn't kill the FBI agents the same way, because he's like, yeah, there's cameras everywhere. So if Light attempted to do the same thing he did, like, with Ray Pember on the train line and everything like that, like, Light was there, like, in disguise, but back in 2003, there were, like, maybe, like, 2 surveillance cameras that were, like, black and white, pixelated, like, 240p, watching everything. Now, you got like high-def cameras on every street corner, in every train car, dash cams. If Light tried the exact same method to like kill Ray Pember and get all the, the FBI agents and everything, he would have been spotted in a train car or heading home. Elle would have looked at the video footage and they'd be like, oh, it's this guy heading back to where he lives there. Oh, it's Light Yagami. Okay, there we go. So Minoru decides to send a message to the world, but he doesn't do it over the internet. I love that. Instead, he uses Sakura TV, which is the television station that, you know, Misa attacked and everything during the show and everything. Really, very prominent, you know, location in Death Note. And so he literally just tells Ryuk to memorize a message, travel under his house, travel through the ground, pop up in the television station, use a pen and paper from the station, write a message, and then just hold it up in front of the camera during the 6 o'clock news. And I'm like, that's kind of brilliant. You know, you can't track him because, you know, it's just he's traveling underground beneath the sewer and the subway. And you're just like, whoop, and you still get your message across to the people of the world. So yeah, Ryuk does that, and he, like, gives the message, and he's just like, the power of Kira is for sale, and it's a magical floating piece of paper, so everyone just kind of has to believe that that's a real thing. And he's like, just comment how much money you are willing to spend for the Death Note on hashtag power of Kira. And I'm like, he's using Twitter. I'm like, okay, I mean, right? I mean, he's a young kid. It's 2019 in the context of this manga, so I'm like, just roll with that. All right, cool. So he uses Twitter for the selling of the Death Note. All right, cool. So Nier finds out about this. Nier in this chapter, he has like wicked long hair at this point. He's just chilling out, playing with everything. He's actually trying to make a like a replica of Ryuk's face to make like a facial recognition software so it can like scale, like if a camera sees a Shinigami, but he's not really working that hard with it because it's kind of like difficult because no one except somebody that's touched the Death Note can see it. But that's what Nier's been up to. In case any other Shinigami come into the living world and keep doing this crap, right? I want to find out where they're at and then we'll be good. If you can have a camera that can see a Shinigami or can sense a Shinigami, it's like, oh, there you go, hanging out next to that person. That person's Kira. Boom, boom, done, right? So, Nier, I'll be honest with you, though, it is nice to see him again. He doesn't play a very integral role here. At least last time with Kira, he made the announcement, like, you bore me, I have nothing to do with you, I'm not gonna go with this case. Here, Nier is like, alright, let's see what he does. And then you see what he does, and he's like, oh, well, nothing I can do about this. Nier kind of has to admit defeat at the end of this chapter. It's very interesting from that perspective. But, so as you can imagine, all over the world, people are, you know, tweeting, and they're like, oh, $800,000 for Kira's power, 2 million, 5 million, 10 million for Kira's power, right? It just balloons and balloons. It keeps getting higher and higher to the point where it's even more money than even the richest person in the world can have. It's like 200, 300, you know, billion US dollars. I think the richest person in the world right now, it's Bezos, right? It's Jeff Bezos, the Amazon guy, right? So he has, I think it's like over $100 billion, but it's getting to the point where it's like not even a normal fortune, like for like not like just a one-person fortune. This is like the GDP of countries we're getting into here, like where countries are coming out like the US and China, and countries are like, oh, we'll bid, you know, 300 billion for Kira's power, 500 billion for Kira's power. And so that, I mean, that's once again something you would expect to happen. Nier even says in this chapter, like, I called this notebook the worst mass murder weapon in human history, and, you know, weapons of mass murder and destruction are traded every day between nations and all that stuff, so just the act of selling the Death Note, I guess, isn't considered illegal because, you know, people trade weapons all the time, right? I mean, that would be kind of like me trying to sell something like an A-bomb or something. I'd be like, yeah, I think that's still illegal, so Nier, I think you could still get involved here. But yeah, so that's the way they're looking at this. You know, Menoru's not writing anything in the notebook, keep in mind. So, I think the thing that most people are going to remember from this one-shot, and the thing, like, every time I go on Facebook to, like, you know, look through and I see people posting about the one-shot, it's like, man, this is a crazy chapter. The one panel I always see being shared, is the fact that Ryuk gives the Death Note to Donald Trump. And I have to say, when they were sitting down and trying to figure out what this, what the plot of this was going to be about, what Oba was going to write about, I have to think that one of the things that entered his head was, what if the Death Note got in the hands of a world leader? Because that's a new way to spin it, right? I mean, like, that would definitely be a new way to spin it. What happens if the president or the king or the dictator of an entire nation got their hands on a Death Note? what hilarity would ensue, right? So he kind of does that, but not really. All right, so eventually, Donald Trump, which the way they convey Donald Trump, I mean, remember back in the original Death Note, they had a guy, I think his name was George Cyrus or something, and he was the president of the US back then. He looked a lot like George Bush. All right, so this isn't like a new thing that they're doing here. All right, so they just straight up, they just have Donald Trump here. Trump, of course, is... I can't believe I'm talking about Donald Trump in the context of as a manga character. Like, so Donald Trump already knows that the Death Note exists because the U.S. already knew. Nier told, like, the previous vice presidents and the FBI directors that existed, so he knows, obviously, as well. It's probably in the Book of Secrets. You know, the U.S. Book of... the Presidential Book of Secrets? Yeah, it's probably there. Nick Cage probably told him, okay? This isn't the first time I've seen Trump in a manga, by the way. He was also a character in Inuyashiki. He was a little bit more, like... over the top with that one, though, if you know that interpretation of Trump. This one, they keep him, I mean, he has a little bit of Trumpisms in his, like, expressions and stuff, but for the most part, they treat him as just any, like, he's the leader of the U.S., okay? So he's like, we want this Death Note. He, bids, 1 quadrillion yen, which comes out to around $10 trillion. Finally, Minoru's like, yep, that's good. And so, yeah, that's good enough. So, he's like, yeah, you guys win. The Death Note will be sold to the United States of America for 10 trillion US dollars. In fact, I think this is 10 trillion, right? I looked over this a few times. That's 10 trillion dollars, right? Yeah, okay. So now we get to the end of the chapter, the master plan here. How the hell is Minoru gonna collect this money, right? Because he's like, you know, by the way, going beyond the fact this is more money than anybody could possibly know what to do with, you know, just like with one person. Like, do you plan, like, does Minoru plan, like, I honestly had no idea what he was going to do. Like, does Minoru plan on buying his own country? Like, where is this going? Minoru, do you want to buy Japan? Like, why are you doing this, right? But no, the spin on this is he announces how, like, the money is going to be distributed or paid to the buyer. Paid to the, you know, the seller. And he sends Ryuk to do the message thing again, and it says that the money will be deposited in equal amounts to every single person in Japan that has a Yotsuba bank account that is 60 years and younger. That is also genius. And Nier even has to admit defeat, like, right then and there. He's like, there's millions of people that have those accounts that are under the age of 60. The reason I'm assuming why Minoru wanted to wait 2 years to give the Death Note over to Ryuk and come back is in those 2 years he would open up a bank account. By that point, he was like in middle school. He was too young to open a bank account, but now he's a high school student. I didn't have a bank account when I was in high school, but I guess you could. Japan's different. You can open up a bank account maybe when you're like 16 or whatever. I waited till I was like 18 or 19 to open mine up or something. I didn't have one in high school, but yeah, so he probably waited for the 2 years for him to open up the bank account. Then he's like, yeah, everybody that has one of these bank accounts that's the age 60 and younger gets equal distribution of the money. And it doesn't matter that there's millions of people that have the accounts because there's so much. You have to understand, a quadrillion yen that could pay off the national debt of Japan. It's 10 trillion US dollars. And it turns out that every single person with a bank account, even divided up by the millions, they each get about $10 million. So yeah. Everybody's rich, essentially. And it's great because I'm like, wow, man, he used the Death Note. He was like a good person, right? He's just like, yeah. Maybe Minoru felt bad. He's like, you know, Japan's kind of, you know, because of Kira and what he did. I'm going to use the Death Note for, you know, the benefit of everybody, right? He didn't really want to kill everybody. He didn't have the desire. He didn't have the God complex that Light did, you know? So he's like, we're just going to do it this way. We're going to play by the rules, and I'm going to circumvent it and do something different, right? So he does that, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else really important before we move on to the final scene of the manga, the final big climax here. We do get to see the other members of the task force, like Matsuda, but they only have like one little, you know, scene, really. There's really nothing major that happens with them. And, you know, there's, like, other people in the chapter that are talking about how, oh, yes, this can pay off the national debt of Japan and everything like that. Like, there's a lot of money talk in this chapter, obviously. But eventually, yeah, we get to the point where it's like, okay, that's how they're gonna do it. And the Bank of Japan, the Yotsuba Bank, is obviously like, whoa, that's a lot of money. So they set up rules and everything, like, you can only withdraw the money after a month, and it can only be in this certain, like $100,000 increments at a time or something. But yeah, so the U.S. pays the amount of money to Japan, and then Ryuk goes to deliver the Death Note to the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald John Trump. Okay, but there's a little bit of a catch. So before he goes to Trump, Ryuk has to stop over in the Shinigami world. Armo Justin, the guy that's the Shinigami that has all of the jewels on him, he's like a skeleton covered in jewels. He says to Ryuk, it's like, hey, as soon as you get time, you gotta go back and see the old man, because he has something he wants to talk to you about. And so Ryuk's like, okay, so he stops over at the Shinigami world, goes to the Shinigami King, and the king is pissed. The king is like, how could you let him sell the Death Note? No. That's not how this works. So the Shinigami King is so pissed, he adds a new rule to the Death Note. And the new rule is, if anybody buys or sells the Death Note, the buyer will die as soon as they get possession of the notebook. The seller will die as soon as they collect the money or whatever compensation they exchanged it for. There will be no, you know, exchanging the Death Note for for profit. Like, it's not gonna happen, all right? Because, and let me just tell you what happens with the rest of this, and then we'll get to, like, what I feel about this, and why this feels so great, like, why this is so poetic to me, okay? So, Ryuk tells the president of the United States about this. He's like, yeah, there's this new rule, so you paid all that money for it, but the second you touch this, you die. So Trump is like, okay, so I'm not going to accept this. And so Ryuk's like, all right, but I'm going to lie to the American people and the world and say that I did get my hands on this, and I just won't use it because I'm for world peace and all that stuff. And obviously he can't use it because he doesn't have it. And so Ryuk's like, very shrewd, Mr. President. And then Ryuk takes the notebook and goes back to the Shinigami world. Now you might think, like, hey, I'll tell you what, I mean, like, I don't really think that's something that's just like Trump would come up with. I honestly think like any world leader would probably do the same basic thing. Like, oh, I'll die if I get my hands on the Death Note. All right, I'll just lie to the people that I have it, and then they'll think I'm better because I'm not using it, right? You know, politicians lying? I think that's something that only happens in America, if you know, personally, right? No, so, yeah. So, I mean, that makes sense from any, like, high-standing politician's perspective, right? So, you know, Ryuk goes back to the Shinigami world, and Minoru, after about a month or whatever, after the banks allow withdrawals of the accounts, Minoru goes to the bank, and he's like, I would like to withdraw like $100,000 or, you know, how many, like 1,000,000 yen or however much that is. And they're like, okay, sir, and here you go. And the second he touches the money, Minoru drops dead of a heart attack right there in the bank. And that's the end of the manga. And Ryuk's back in the Shinigami world like, man, I wish there was somebody that could use this thing as long as Light could, man. And when am I going to get fed again properly? And that's the end of the manga. So... Now, a lot of people were like, that's kind of a cop-out ending. I don't think it's a cop-out ending, because Ryuk even mentions it. He's like, man, anybody that uses the Death Note really does meet an unfortunate end. They're just plagued with misfortune and misery. And that's when you start, and that's something Ryuk, by the way, even said at the very beginning of the manga, like when he first meets Light, actually. Let me see if I can pull that scene up here. Because there's a moment where Light asks Ryuk something like, you know, are you going to take my soul, or what's the payment for me using your notebook? And Ryuk's like, oh, I'm not going to do anything to you. And Light's like, so I can use the Death Note with absolutely no repercussions. And Ryuk's like, well, let's just say this. You will know the pain and misery of anybody that... I can't find it. It might have been maybe something just added in the anime, but... You will know the pain and suffering of everybody that has used the Death Note before you. You will be plagued with misfortune. And of course, he ends it out by saying, any human that has used a Death Note can neither go to heaven nor hell for eternity. Later on, we find out that actually that's because all humans in the Death Note universe go to the same place when they die, a place called Mu, nothingness. So it doesn't matter if you use a Death Note or not, you all go to the same place when you die. But he does say misfortune. So the way I think this works from the Shinigami King's perspective is like he creates the Death Notes. He decides the rules. He's the one that decides on all this stuff. He wants to, like, you know, whenever a human gets their hands on it, you know, misery and suffering has to be the end result. All right? It doesn't have to be immediate, but it has to eventually be the case. Any human that uses a Death Note is going to meet suffering. And even if somebody like Menorah comes along that kind of finds a way to weasel his way through the rules and manage to get out clean on the other side, the Shinigami King doesn't care. He's like, no. Oh, you think you're clever, huh? You think you managed to look at the rules of the Death Note. You think you managed to get out of it, well, ahead of the game, you know, so you managed to become happy rather than, you know, manage to meet misfortune, you know, because of the Death Note. Well, guess what? I'm the Shinigami King, kid. I get to decide the rules. I think that makes sense. I don't see that as a cop-out. Imagine if you, like do the Faustian deal with the devil, all right? Like, let's say you meet the devil, and the devil is like, he does the traditional, like, I'll grant you a wish in exchange for your mortal soul. I'll give you something here in the mortal realm. In exchange, you go to hell when you die, okay? Then your soul is mine for suffering, okay? And so, there was actually a show I used to watch. It was a Canadian drama called The Collector, where it was a very lesser-known show. You know, clap to anybody that's ever heard of it. But it was about the devil making deals with humans, and the deals would, of course, always end in a really misfortunate way, even if the deal was try to better people's lives, even if the deal was really clever and try to snake its way around the devil to avoid getting the person's soul taken. The devil was always one step ahead. The devil always kind of knew how to, like, weasel his way through it because he's the freaking devil, right? So let's say in this case you get a Faustian deal with the devil, and let's say you're really clever. The devil gives you the rules of stuff you can wish for, and you think about all the rules, and you manage to figure out a way to kind of have your cake and eat it too. So you get the thing that the devil gives you, but you also manage to weasel your way out, based on the rules that the devil gives you. And so finally, it comes your time to die, and you're super clever, and you're just like, ha, screw you, devil. I can't go to hell because I managed to phrase my wish in such a way. I managed to get all my money and power, and I don't have to go to hell anymore. And then the devil's like, oh, yeah, you were super clever, weren't you? Hey, guess what? I'm changing the rules because I'm the freaking devil. I get to decide how this works. I'm the one in charge. I don't care about fairness. Who gets to decide fairness? Me, because I'm the devil, right? And so you're still going to hell. Bye. Boot, you know? So I like to think that's how it ended up here. I don't see it as a cop-out. I see it like, nope, the Shinigami King's like, any person that uses the Death Note is going to be met with suffering and misery. And Light ended up dying. Sorichio Yagami, he owned it for a little bit. He made the ideal. He immediately died. And then Minoru's like, I'm going to use it this way. He's like, no, you're not. No, that's clever of you. Too bad. You're still dying because I'm the one that decides the rules. So I like that, right? And you know what? You know what, though? Minoru still kind of benefited the entire country of Japan because it's not like everybody dies. You know, Minoru managed to make it so that they have the Reiwa bubble or the Kira bubble. This huge economy boom. Like, millions of Japanese people still have over $10 million in their bank accounts. They're spending, like, everybody, like, these poor people that can barely have, like, enough money for 2 apples to eat every night. They now have, you know, a house to live in and a nice, like, the economy is going crazy. So Minoru, at personal sacrifice, did manage to make the world a better place. It's just that he's not getting off scot-free. There's no way. Some people have also brought up the, like, well, how could you have a buyer and a seller if Trump didn't technically accept it, so there was no buyer? Once again, the Shinigami King is probably not splitting hairs on this. He's like, no. If there's ever an exchange with the Death Note for some sort of, like, good or service or anything, you know, the person that receives the compensation for that, as soon as they touch that, they die. If Minoru never touched that money, he would have been okay. So I guess, like, if Minoru decided not to accept the money, and if Minoru just went and worked at a McDonald's and made money on his own, he would have been fine. The second he touched that money, he was dead. And then the same thing with Trump. It's like, yeah, Trump chose not to accept it, but if he ever happens to touch that Death Note, you know, then that would happen. So, yeah, there's some, like, questions there about what buying and selling and the context mean and everything, but I liked it. I think it was a great one-shot. Let me know what you guys think of it below. I am curious to see if this video is going to be monetized or not. I'm mentioning mass death and the trading of, like, weapons of mass murder and destruction. I mentioned terrorist groups. Just the fact I mentioned Donald Trump. That might be enough. I don't know. We'll see where this goes. All right. Have a great night, everybody. Go and pick yourself up some golden delicious apples. Tekking, signing out. Stay away from the Death Note. You see a Death Note on the ground, just leave it. Bye.